With version 6.4 drip marketing finally revealed and the banners now officially confirmed, it's time to properly analyze their pull value along with the key advantages and disadvantages so you can decide the best option for your account. So let's start with Flins. Right now, Flins is one of the strongest DPS characters in the game, sitting in the same tier as other lunar DPS units and just slightly below Mavuika when played with optimal combos. What makes Flins so strong is how easy he is to play. On top of that, being a lunar DPS means he synergizes perfectly with Columbina, while Inefa acts as his best-in-slot support. He also has very solid free-to-play team options. Units like Fischl and Sucrose work extremely well with them, making Flins one of the better DPS choices for free-to-play players. However, Flins does have real disadvantages. He only truly works in lunar charge setups. Unlike Varka, who has access to multiple team archetypes, Flins does not function well outside his core reaction. Another issue is his support dependency. Flins effectively has only two premium supports, Columbina and Inefa. If you don't own either of them, he actually prefers playing with strong 4-star supports because no other 5-star support currently works well with him. This makes Flins feel far more restricted in team building compared to characters like Varka, who can use multiple 5-star supports without issues. We'll properly evaluate his pull value later once we compare him to the other banners. Before moving on, quick reminder, let's move on to Skirk. Skirk is another DPS rerunning next version. Her current best team, Skirk, Escoffier, Farina, and Shenhe, sits around 125,000 DPS. I personally tried learning her animation cancels, and even after nearly breaking my fingers, the DPS gain was only around 5,000 more. Even without perfect execution, Skirk is still a very strong unit. That said, she absolutely needs both Escoffier and Farina to even compete with current top-tier teams. And this is where her biggest issue comes in. The support that works best with Skirk, Escoffier, is just as restricted as Skirk herself. This means that to play Skirk at full power, you need to pull two characters that mostly only work with each other. This is very different from Inefa, who can be played in Hyperbloom, Overvape, Lunar Charge, and many other archetypes. On top of that, the current state of cryo is not very healthy, which makes heavy investment into cryo teams feel questionable right now. We'll come back to this point later. Now, let's talk about Escoffier herself. In theory, Escoffier can work with any freeze team. In reality, most older freeze DPS units are simply too weak. Even with all her buffs, they still struggle to clear modern endgame content. This leaves us with only one truly viable DPS option for her, Skirk. Yes, you can play Escoffier as an off-field cryo applicator and healer in teams like Mavuka or Arlecchino, but there are simply better options for those roles. However, if you pull both Skirk and Escoffier, their combined value is extremely high. Together, they form one of the strongest duos in the entire game, and they can completely solve your cryo needs for a long time, assuming Hoyoverse doesn't suddenly release another top-tier cryo DPS. And finally, let's talk about Varka. Varka's situation is complicated. Based on early calculations and currently known teams, his damage output sits around free-to-play Skirk levels, which is honestly disappointing for players who have been waiting for him for years. Usually, the first beta brings major changes, and if Hoyoverse truly wanted to buff Varka significantly, they likely would have done so already. Because we haven't seen any meaningful changes, it's reasonable to assume that Varka may end up being the weakest DPS among these banners. This leads us with only two possible scenarios. First, Hoyoverse could add Varka to the standard banner, which would be shocking, especially considering his lore importance, his gameplay design, and the fact that he uses dual claymores. Comparing him to characters like Diluc would feel absurd. The second possibility is that Nicole turns out to be an absolutely broken support. For example, if she provides massive pyro resistance shred or enables powerful pyro swirl interactions, she could completely elevate Varka's teams. If you look closely, Varka's current best teams resemble Skirk's free-to-play setups. Right now, his best team with Durin, Venti, and Bennett performs roughly the same or even slightly worse than his wheelchair-style team with Columbina and Inefa, and that is honestly shocking. So, with all that said, let's now move on to the priority list, starting with the most valuable unit out of all these options, Flins. Right now, Flins is clearly the strongest DPS among these banners. And because most players already own either Columbina or Inefa, Flins becomes the safest and most efficient option to secure a fully meta team. That said, as we discussed earlier, pulling multiple Nod-krai DPS units can be a mistake, because you are almost never going to use them together in real endgame content. The good news is that Flins has excellent free-to-play flexibility. You can pair him with Fischl and Sucrose in a Hexenzirkel-style team, and he is still strong enough to comfortably clear Abyss. Other 4-star supports like Auroron, Janssen, and Kuki also work decently with him. This makes Flins surprisingly flexible for a lunar DPS, especially compared to other Nod-krai units. Now moving on to Skirk and Escoffier. If you ask me, for players who own neither Skirk nor Escoffier, it is generally better to skip both entirely. Instead, you are better off investing those pulls into a more versatile team like Mavuka Melt, or another Nod-krai team that does not lock you into a single archetype. However, if you already own one of them, then it is strongly recommended to complete the duo. Together, Skirk and Escoffier are still one of the strongest DPS support combinations in the entire game, and for now, they do not look like they will be power crept anytime soon. Now let's talk about Varka. Varka is a very interesting character. Even though his raw damage is lower compared to the other DPS options, he actually offers far more flexibility than almost anyone else on this list. You can play Varka with Nod-krai units like Columbina and Inefa, or run him in more general team setups using some of the most broken supports in the game. For Anemo teams, he has Venti. For Pyro setups, he can work with Durin, Mavuka, and Bennett. And for Hydro-based teams, he can use Farina, Yelan, and Mona. Because many of these units are from Mondstadt, Varka can actually be a very solid option for newer players. That said, his pull value heavily depends on one key factor. If Varka is added to the standard banner, then he becomes an easy skip, because you will eventually get him anyway. But if he is not added to standard, then pulling him becomes a risk, especially if his value depends on Nicole turning out to be an extremely strong support. Based on his current damage numbers alone, Varka is simply not worth spending 80 pulls on. So with that in mind, plan carefully. I hope this video helped you make a clearer decision. And don't forget to hit the subscribe button. We are very close to 11,000 subscribers. Till then.